Okay, it is 10:02 here, and I think we have most of the attendees here. Hi, everyone. This is Drew Decker with U.S. Geological Survey. I'm a National Map Liaison in California and going to host the meeting today. Alex Jonasy with Topographic Data Services is also on the call today as well. You can see the call is being recorded, so please take note of that. And we are also going to be putting out the video or recording of the call within the next several days. So what we're going to be covering today, 3D Hydrography Program, transition status, July 25th, 23. Thank you, Steve. You're showing your screen there, I believe.
Yes, yep.
Okay, yep. So, okay, going to kick my other image off. And so I think we are ready to go. What we'll be doing today, I believe Steve here and Sue is, I don't know if Sylvia is, but the hydrography program leads will be covering another update for the NHD to 3D HP program transition. And I think without any further ado, we will go ahead and get started with the presentation. Once the presentation's over, we will have some time for questions and answers, and Alex and I will try to assist in ensuring that we see them all and discuss as they come up. And after that, we'll have time perhaps for any other announcements from the group, from the community, which is, of course, everybody here on the call today. So without any further ado, I guess, Steve, please feel free to take it away.
All right. Thank you, Drew. Let's go camera on here. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. It looks like 103 people, so it's a strong turnout for a community call. It's been a couple months since we talked. It'd be good to get an update for the community on where we are and where we're going. I'll admit a lot of this material is material you have seen before if you're a regular, if you tune into this program regularly. But in the spirit of sort of ongoing soap operas, we do need to provide a little bit of a recap at the beginning, so there'll be some repeated information going forward. A little overview of where we are, of what we're doing today. First, what are we doing? Second, why are we doing it? Where are we in the process, and where are we going? And then we'll field some questions. And this agenda should be about half an hour or so. Then I'll turn it over to Sue Buto to talk about developments in the acquisition program. And then, as Drew mentioned, we'll have whatever additional comments or questions at the end of the hour. And so with that, this is what we're doing. We are we're remapping the hydrography of the nation for the first time since the original 24K topo maps were made. This is kind of a big deal, and it's very much needed. We will have new data, we'll have new databases, and we'll have new products as a result of this. But it's also a fairly big bit of work to bite off here. I think it's important to point out it's not a decision we made lightly. This has been a long time coming, and it's been driven by a number of factors. Sort of, fundamentally, why are we doing it? I mean, at some very basic level, it's because it's our job, and we, can and should be doing that job better than we have been. People like to talk about, things are, now more than ever, and urgent isn't always necessarily important, but there's, more and more demand for data that, that is multi-scalar, right? That goes from very local, precise data to national scales for a lot of different applications, international applications in some cases. And this data needs to be both accurate and precise, and also of known quality. And these are things that have been challenging for the hydrography program for many years. We've had a lot of successes in hydrography over the years. Linear referencing of hydrography has been a great success. We have a lot of, and you all have a lot of events mapped to the NHD, and we're going to help you preserve those. The NHD Plus, has really demonstrated the value of catchments. That's kind of a new addition in some ways, but catchments are a very important piece of the hydrologic system. And then, frankly, the hydrography requirements and benefits study showed that, showed back in 2016, that there was a lot of demand and a lot of additional value to, improving how we delivered hydrography data. Maybe particularly in the case of being able to provide updates more rapidly. In the current environment, it's, weeks to months to see an NHD edit actually documented in the data set or actually published out in the data set. To see that data come through into an NHD plus data set that is with value-added attributes and catchments is years. And that's not the kind of environment that's not the world we live in anymore. So we need to be able to do this better, and that's where we're going. Our legacy data sets have been a great boon for hydrologic science over the years. The NHD today is still the most comprehensive and current data of the nation's surface waters, and that's largely a result of the work of this community. 41 states and DC have had stewardship agreements with us at one time or another. There are a lot of contributions, particularly early on, but frankly, that stewardship participation has dwindled in the last several years. Some of that's budget tightening, some of that's reprioritization in different places, but it's where the stewardship program is not as vibrant as it was. And then some of this is just a matter of the uniformity and consistency of the updates, because some places have done very robust updates of their data sets, very precise mapping, some very precise attribution. The consistency of the data sets has decreased since they were originally transcribed from the 24K maps, which makes it difficult to know what you're getting as a consumer, as a user of the data, as a scientist trying to apply the data. And so, this is a challenge we're trying to address. It's also, frankly, in some ways, the 3DEP data is making us look bad, right? The NHD data just don't really align very well with the 3D elevation program data. And they were never really intended to. They were collected plus or minus 40 feet. 3DEP data is 1 meter LiDAR. It's going to show the problems in the hydrography data. So that's sort of where we're coming from. I'll push this up in part because it shows, keep in mind, this is just the overview of what happens as, sort of a line becomes a published NHD product. There's a lot of process in the background happening to actually make the NHD data. And this is almost everything you see here is built on Arc desktop technology, Arc objects, which is going to be end of life here soon. Where our deadline currently is February to get off of the Arc desktop stack, and so this is a significant challenge for us. I was told some time ago this is about 250,000 lines of code to keep the enterprise running. We also have a lot of data in the stack here. This is, it started with the NHD up in the upper left, and this was really originally designed in the late 90s for 1 to 100,000 scale data, and a lot of the tools and processes and concepts came forward to the high res, the 24K data that was finished in 2007, and then we added the watershed boundary data set, which was largely an independent data set when it was created, and then sort of grafted into the NHD. And then back about 2016, we started producing the NHD plus high res, which again is a similar related data set, but a different data set that incorporated features from the NHD, the WBD, and the elevation data sets. And so this is a lot of complexity to keep synchronized. It's a lot of redundancy across the data sets, and there's a lot of processing to keep all this together. Again, I'll call out the ARC desktop tools that we have, and keep working with to try to keep these data sets together. And mention that frankly, moving these tools to our ARC Pro environment or to a different environment probably was not technically feasible with the resources available. Also note a lot of these tools started back with the medium res, and so there's a lot of very dated coding going on here. The issue, one of the real issues, is that they're also all interrelated. So you can't just change one. You start to change the whole suite of the whole ecosystem of tools. And so these are all sort of conceptual changes that we need to make to keep things moving forward. So why we're moving to 3D HP? Frankly, even after 16 years, the NHD data is still primarily based on the topographic map data. More than half of those lines derive from the blue lines on the maps. The stewardship model has been challenged through the years, and has resulted in some strong inconsistencies. Some of those lines are 40 years old in places. Some of them they're updated a few months ago, and it's really hard to know, particularly as a consumer for a regional or national level application. It's hard to know what you're getting. As that stewardship participation has been declining, we've also we've not been able to reduce the stewardship, the support infrastructure for remote editing, and that was one of the things that was really sort of shocking to me when I came in here, was that we put about 40% of our budget in FY22 into supporting the remote editing environment in sort of all its all its facets, but that only resulted in about 1% of the flow lines in CONUS getting updated, and so we need to look pretty hard at that return. And then finally, we do have to migrate this whole enterprise off of ARC Desktop, and that's a fairly significant challenge in and of itself. So we looked at this as an opportunity rather than a cliff, and looked at how to try to take what we're doing in hydrography, everything we've learned over the last 25 years of making hydrography data, and how to make this a better system. And that really results in the 3D Hydrography Program. First and foremost, we want to align this data spatially and temporally with the elevation data, so we have a coherent data set. But also, we've learned a lot in 3DEP. Many of you are participants in the 3DEP program as well. And we've learned how to do governance. We've learned how to do acquisitions. We've learned a lot about contracting and data validation. We also have an opportunity here to really, rather than work from a cartographic data set and try to force it to do hydrology, to really build the system around hydrologic applications first as a priority. And we're going to communicate the results through maps, but we want to be able to analyze this data for models and for hydrologic applications. We also want to maybe stick to our knitting a little bit and make sure that in data sets where there is another authoritative source, like Fish and Wildlife's National Wetlands Inventory, we're using their data. We're linking to their data rather than trying to replicate the data. That's not a good use of anybody's resources, and probably just feeds confusion. And then finally, we want to try to make sure we can provide interoperability with other data sets, soils data, land cover, transportation, eventually, other relevant things that people would analyze with the hydrography data. So with that context of why we're moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit about where we are now. And these are maybe not particularly attractive slides, but we'll work through this. One of the big things we needed to do was establish some formal governance. The hydrography community has been had some ad hoc governance over the years through, we had an NHD management team years ago. We have this community call, which provides feedback, but we really needed to move to executive governance through the 3D National Topography Model, THIC, and then data set governance through the 3D Hydrography Program working group. And those have both been achieved. We need to retire these legacy products to free up resources to build the new products. And so we'll talk a little bit specifically about the NHD, the NHD plus high res, and the WBD in a minute here. We need to stand up a systematic data acquisition process rather than kind of ad hoc data acquisition, data improvement. We need some system, some process that can that stands a chance of acquiring the whole country eventually. And then finally, we need to implement data validation and data management systems. We obviously had a lot of data management systems for the NHD, but we never really had data validation, particularly in a spatial sense in NHD. We checked, there are a variety of checks that happened automatically for topology, for example, but we've really stood up a data validation process for hydrography from almost nothing. And that's been actually been a fairly significant success story here. And then finally, we need to actually introduce the systems and products that get that data out to you as users and the public. So this is sort of like your flight status board. Probably better than some flight status boards recently, but this is where we are. We need to close the markup submissions, and we planned that for November 30th. I did actually close November 30th of last year. We need to complete the markups, so actually get them implemented. We'll have more about that, but that actually had to end early because of some other changes to the way the program is going to be implemented this year. And that the big driver there was closing external editing was held for 90 days. Frankly, because there was a lot of outcry from users that we had, more projects, more data you need to get in. So we held that open until March 31st. Right now, we are planning to still publish a final version in NHD this fiscal year, probably significantly before September 30th, but we'll leave September 30th up there as a target. We have completed updates to the NHD Plus high res. That data is available for download now. And will be available in the version 2 of the national release, probably in March. There's some other attribute items in there that we want to update, and those are taking a little bit longer than we planned. So that final national release will be in March. We did close WBD editing last month. Kim Jones and her team have been working with that, and we'll be working on publishing a final version of the WBD. There will be a version this year, and then Kim and her team are going to go back and work on a variety of changes that they've been eyeing for a while, and we'll have another version, maybe actually more like a final version next year. So that's sort of where the retiring the legacy systems stands. In terms of markup progress, this was actually a fairly big success story. And I'll talk a little bit about why this was different than planned. So we had 10,007 total markups to work through. Of those, 9,487 were implemented, and I'll do the math right there. 520 were not. But what happened here was because of two things. One, because we had to keep editing open longer than anticipated. That blocked a number of places where where markups needed to be made. But we also needed to end markups earlier to incorporate the NHD into the 3D HP data set. That was a change that came about in late first quarter, about December of last calendar year, and changed our workflow trajectory for the year. So there were 520 that were not implemented. Most of those were notes to ourselves. So those are USGS submitted markups that we'll work through, and the bulk of those were in Hawaii, and that was sort of a strategic decision because having those markups in Hawaii Hawaii isn't really connected to anything else. So it makes it a little bit easier to change those without disrupting the rest of the network. So we talked a little bit about this retiring NHD editing. Holding the NHD open until March 31st. A number of folks asked for that. Nobody's request was denied. They were held open until March 31st, and actually maybe a couple of days later than that for some real stragglers. But that did change where we're able to do the markup work because of the checkouts and check-ins and so forth. And again, it really changed sort of the trajectory of ramping down the resource commitment, the effort for NHD, and ramping up the effort for 3D-HP, because we had to keep really all of NHD up and running through the second quarter of the year and into the third quarter of the year. We didn't have as much resources to put to 3D-HP, and we'll talk about what changes came about as a result of that. As I mentioned, we did also have a shift where originally, if you tuned into this about a year ago, we had planned to really just populate 3D-HP with validated elevation-derived hydrography and link that together with kind of a skeletal network. Again, as a result of feedback, we made the change to actually move the entire NHD into the 3D-HP database. But that meant that we had to close editing, that we had to close the markup process earlier to get that final NHD to load into 3D-HP. So here's the old plan about populating with a skeletal data set. And again, it's the old plan. New plan is to populate with that final version of the NHD, and that is moving along and will happen. We also have quite a lot of validation going on. So there's a lot of data piling up, ready to go in. But this allows everybody to have the best available data in one data set, even if that is older legacy data. We talked about the data model, and you've seen this slide before. I won't belabor this too much, other than we are moving to a more modern system that is in more of an international standard rather than kind of our own proprietary data model. Sharing this with again other agencies, Canadians, doing some shared development with the National Water Center, and so this is a big step towards interoperability. Just a reminder of where we came from. Again, so NHD with about 150 different F codes, WBD, NHD plus high res, somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 altogether. This is the new one that actually contains 95% of the features from NHD, WBD, and NHD plus, but only about 10% of the feature types. So actually, I think it's 22 when I counted them. And a lot of that's achieved by just reducing repetition. So we're not repeating things in the WBD and in the NHD plus, or in the NHD and the NHD plus. We're really first focusing on the hydrologic content. And those 5% of features that didn't make it are the ones that maybe you could probably pick out a few of them as examples. Things like swimming pools and rocks and locks and sounding datum lines. Things that were in the data set because they were shown as water features on the NHD, or on the topographic maps, and migrated into NHD, but haven't really been a focus of maintenance or updates. So these elemental feature types that are out there, really very much simpler flow line feature types, but also much more likely to be correctly applied. Similar with water bodies, there's a much more limited set, but we expect to have much higher attribute accuracy on those. Hydrolocations, these are points. These are actually maybe kind of like nodes in the old data set, but these are kind of important points in the network that where something significant happens. And we'll have a presentation later on, not today, but at a future call to go into this in more detail. As we get it documented. Catchments are integral to the system now, and are kind of the critical aerial element, and that allows us to this allows us to link the landscape to the water feature. And then drainage areas are accumulations of catchments. And again, unlike in NHD Plus, where these were kind of done as a sequential step, these things were all kind of core to the data set and happening, ideally with an update cycle of something on the order of, a month to two. We'll see how we do at achieving that. It may not happen right out of the gate, but that's the target. Remember I showed that cloud diagram a while back of sort of how an edit becomes NHD or NHD plus. This is sort of the different, this is a simpler version of how a feature gets from input data on the left over to a user view on the right. And really that a lot of what's happening here is kind of the equivalent of like object-oriented programming, if that come from that world. But it's setting up a set interface between each set of processes, so that on the input side, there's a format that's expected, and you can use whatever software you want to use to create that elevation-derived hydrography. And we will validate that to make sure that it meets the specifications. And then there's a tool that ingests that into the database. And that database is relatively isolated from the input data. It's not sort of an interactive crossover anymore, but it's relatively isolated. And then we add sort of the value added stuff in that process, so that you have network derivatives, and you have catchments, and you have names, all the sorts of stuff that goes along with having a good data set. And then again, that's stuff that we need to be able to tweak from now and then to maintain good functioning. And so that again is isolated, and kind of the equivalent of an API. We actually generate user views of that data so that people can know what to expect, and we can keep sort of the internal functioning of that data set behind the curtain a little bit, and keep it from keep it from being a multi-year process to implement changes. If you think back to how long it took us to get drainage ways into the NHD, and that was because all of the tools needed to be changed all the way from the beginning, from the editing tools out to the publication tools. We're hoping to get away from that liability. We'll also have this primarily published as services, and then we'll have punctuated static releases annually to begin with, to make sure that there's a documented record of what happened, and there's a version you can point back to. We are probably not going to get to the cartographic view this year. That's just not. We're going to have an initial addressing view that we'll work with, and then the hydrologic units view will probably be delayed until we get some of the WBD stuff sorted out. Okay, where are we? So we're moving forward on a formal acquisition program, and Sue's going to speak to that in a minute. Again, a success story here is in the review and validation of the data sets. This is becoming a lot more. This started from nothing and is becoming a very functioning, robust part of the operation. We will have the 1 Huck 8 of elevation-derived hydrography available by the end of fiscal year 23, so in 2 months, along with all the rest of the network from NHD published into the 3DHP data model. We'll also have a final NHD posted, and that'll be available effectively forever, or as close to forever as we can maintain. We'll have that penultimate, the not quite final version of WBD published for Kim and her team go back and sort some things out to get that final version done. And then finally, we'll have a NHD Plus high-res national release 2 in the spring of 24 with some added tables to deal with disconnected networks, particularly. Where we're going is to really start to implement the partnership-based acquisitions. And this is Sue's portion of the program. We want to continue to improve the acquisition validation processes, sort of steady state. We want to be bringing in about 300,000 square miles of data a year, and right now we're maybe a third of that. We want to take care of ingesting the backlog of validated deliveries. So we validated quite a few data sets now. They're good data sets. We need to get those published into 3DHP. We'll have opportunities to review and improve the linear referencing view. We'll release a cartographic view in FY24. We're going to be working on developing linear referencing tools, and then working on the markup submission processes, including some of the editing rules on how that comes to be. That's a little bit messier than I guess maybe was originally conceived, and so we have to be a little bit more careful about making when those edits can be made and what else has to change to incorporate specific kinds of edits. But that'll be coming in 24. And then with that, I'll throw some questions and just a little bit of eye candy here. Hopefully, maybe not. There we go. And this is one of our data sets from the Pennsylvania area showing the difference between what you have in NHD and what you'll get in 3DHP. And I guess with that, Drew, I'm a couple minutes over time. I could probably take 1 or 2 questions if they're out there while Sue sets up.
Drew, no questions on the chat here.
All right. Thanks for checking, because that's a little hard to track. Okay. And I will turn it over to Sue. You're muted, Sue.
That helps. Hopefully you can see my screen and hear me at the same time. And thanks, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, I'll just be running through some of the data acquisition basics for the 3DHP. And he mentioned some of this will be potentially repeat material for folks, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with how we understand data acquisition to work for 3DHP. So I'm going to start with the big concept of the 3D National Topography Model that we are implementing to integrate our elevation and hydrography data sets. And this is sort of the organizing principle for our data acquisition work going forward. So you'll see us mention the 3D NTM regularly, again, as sort of the organizing principle for both our elevation and hydrography data going forward. Then I just kind of want to talk about where data acquisition sits in this whole big picture. Steve talked a lot about the tail end of this data lifecycle process, through validation and publication and data access. But where I sit and where my focus is on planning and partnerships and on the data acquisition side. So that's what this will be discussing, maybe a little backwards in the process, the way we deliver this information. So, and I think Steve also mentioned that, we're building the 3D hydrography program based on a lot of the lessons learned and processes developed through the 3DEP acquisition process. So as he mentioned, establishing governance to develop and coordinate partnerships and acquisition plans And that is, on many levels, and I'll show some of those coordination processes or mechanisms that we use, but all the way federal, state, and up into the executive level in the federal government. That's the FIC that Steve mentioned, the Federal Interagency Coordinating Committee. And then providing and maintaining acquisition specifications, and that's really important. We can provide a specification, but we also need the ability to update that spec as we learn from data acquisition. And we are and have been doing that as we've learned how best to do this work in Alaska, and now more frequently in the continental US, and hopefully soon in the islands and territories. And then seeking funding partnerships to the broadest community that we can through an organized partnership process, and then following acquisition best practices. And for us, acquisition best practices sort of include 3 different streams of data. The first is our USGS Geospatial Products and Services Contracts, or the GPSC, which is a multiple award acquisition vehicle where the firms on the contract have been selected to do the work of geospatial data acquisition, not only for 3DEP and 3DHP, but also geophysical data acquisition, imagery, etc. And so this contract includes acquisition and processing and quality assurance for the mapping products that are collected, and then USGS performs validation to ensure that that conforms to the specification. And using the GPSC, we have experienced, particularly in 3DEP, that we get really consistent results because the contractors on the GPSC know how to work with us and they understand the specifications. But there will, in our acquisition process, be options for state and local partners to manage their own acquisition contracts through a financial assistance award or cooperative agreement is most common. In that instance, also, the data that comes through to us must be validated to meet the specification. And then we have not defined this yet, but we will work through a process to take in contributed data. So where partners have done their own data acquisition, our ability to take it in and validate it against the specification and bring it into the national holdings. So in all of this, coordination is really a key sort of through thread. We need to coordinate at many levels and to work together to sort of align our goals towards data acquisition for this national remapping of the nation's hydrography, and identify mutual requirements. And the two biggest important things around coordination, to my mind, is the elimination of duplicated effort and the pooling of resources. So I often say that one agency or entity is really unable to do mapping at a national scale that we're doing. We need to pool our resources in order to make this a success. And so the coordination happens, as I mentioned earlier, at the federal and at the state and local level. Through federal acquisitions, we have, as mentioned, a governance structure that's been stood up through the 3DHP working group, which is intended as a multi-agency federal coordination group, but there is representation from the National States Geographic Information Council as well to bring in a state perspective. And the goal of the 3DHP really is to focus on acquisition strategies to maximize funding to support this mapping effort, but also to move forward together on technological aspects of the data as well. And this is all part of an envisioned 3D national topography model joint governance that supports our 3D nation vision. And then state coordination, really super important to us. Our states have been supporters of hydrography from way back, and we want to continue that collaboration with our state partners. And we do collaborate several ways with our state partners. One, through the National States Geographic Information Council, to engage in our with state GIOs and GIS coordinators and other key stakeholders. And then many of you are aware, and many of you actually are part of our geospatial liaison program with a network of national map liaisons that lead outreach and coordination for our national map products, 3DHP, as well in their respective states and regions. So they're really key to bringing partners together in coordination. And the whole goal here is to align our federal and our non-federal partners into sort of a bigger annual acquisition plan for data collection. And again, both for 3DEP and 3DHP. So on one side, we have the working groups, the federal working groups who identify their mapping priorities and can enter into interagency agreements or do direct acquisitions with us through, again, interagency agreements. And then on the other side, for non-federal partners, a partnership process that gives us a fair and equitable process for non-federal entities to propose areas of interest to them, and then also enter into funding agreements with both us and with our federal partners, bringing match to those proposals. So this brings us to a slight change in the way that we've been doing those proposals. In the past, for those of you who are familiar, we've used a broad agency announcement, or BAA, for data acquisition for 3DEP. And as we put some key elements of the 3D national topography model in place, we're taking the opportunity to shift the process and adapt a little, beginning this fiscal year, that's structured under the 3D national topography model. And the new process is the 3D NTM data collaboration announcement, or DCA. We are planning to release a DCA in September. That's subject to change. We're still working through a few details. And as mentioned, it replaces the broad agency announcement for those of you who have used the BAA in the past. So we're changing some of the processes, and we're changing the acronym under which we work, but we are continuing with the best practices that we've established with the BAA. So as in the past, federal agencies, state and local government, tribal entities and governments, academic institution, the private sector have avenues to submit proposals for data acquisition to the DCA. And as in the past, proposals for projects through the GPSC and projects requesting financial assistance or a cooperative agreement will be accepted. And we envision the application process, or the proposal process, will be largely unchanged. We will change how we're communicating that process. We'll be communicating more through the USGS website, with a simplified and streamlined way of communicating that information. For any of you who have in the past read the BAA program announcement, it's a bit of heavy going, and we'd like to simplify that information to make it a little easier to digest. I will note we're still working through some of the details of the financial assistance process, so that may change a little more as we work through those processes. And our national map liaisons will continue in their role, supporting and coordinating on the landscape, and then helping to develop agreements after proposals have been selected. So the biggest change from the BAA really is the addition of 3DHP to the partnership process. So that sort of keeps with the 3D national topography model goal to integrate our elevation and hydrography. I will have to note a couple things. The proposal process will be separate. So we're under the same umbrella, but we will not be accepting joint 3DEP, 3DHP data collections. There's some logistical things that we need to work through before we can decide whether we can do that. And also 3DHP partnerships will be dependent on the FY24 federal budget. 3DEP has a long-standing understanding of essentially where their budget will come in. And with 3DHP, it's new, so we need to be a little cautious moving forward until we know what the budget entails. We do have a portal for the DCA that's available at the URL you see here, and we'll put a link in the chat. And correspondence will be managed through a couple of new mailboxes. They're both the program 3DEP or 3DHP underbar DCA at usgs.gov. So those of you who have used the BAA in the past, you'll have to erase that BAA email from your memory going forward. And we do know the BAA process took some time to fully establish, and we expect to adjust and improve the process over the next few years. Notably, we hope to be able to move up and potentially lengthen the application window in future years, and that can be particularly important for 3DEP, where there's sometimes some seasonality issues around the timing of the BAA. So we'll see how that works going forward. So I showed you the earlier diagram, and this one is very similar, and that's how we envision it, but now encompassing both 3DEP and 3DHP with our mutual working groups on the federal side working in the same way to do direct data acquisitions with USGS or to provide matching funds for proposals that come in through the DCA, which we expect to still be a fair and equitable process to develop collaborations with our state and local partners. So as we learn more, we'll put more information on the web portal. We do have scheduled for August 9th an informational webinar about the DCA and the process. You can get the meeting invite from the DCA portal, again linked here. You have to just click on the information about the webinar, and there'll be a zipped ICS file that will give you the invitation. And as always, send questions to the inboxes that I have here, and we will also add more information and some FAQs, etc., as we get that information ready to be stood up on the web. So I think I have two more slides. One, I want to point out where we are with data acquisition for 3DHP. Even though we haven't had a formal partnership process with non-federal entities, we have been moving forward with data acquisition, and some of our state partners have been moving forward as well. So you can see in the Alaska map, we've been funding mapping in Alaska since I think 2019. And we have moved forward with roughly 60,000 square miles plus annually since then. And you can see the progress we've made in Alaska. The dark blue are data that are either available or in progress, and the cyan are data that is being contracted or has been awarded this fiscal year. So Alaska is moving forward quite well. For CONUS, islands and territories, you can see where there's been progress made, largely through federal partners wishing to do data acquisitions, notably NRCS and our partners with the U.S. Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest. And you can see where there's been some progress made there, as well as pilots. We're very pleased to know that some of our state partners are moving ahead and thinking forward with either pilots or full projects to do statewide acquisition of new hydrography for the 3DHP, notably Washington State. California is working on pilots, Missouri and Michigan moving forward, and we are very happy that they are doing so. So the last thing I will say is that all this is to sort of highlight that the 3DHP is a community investment and partners are really key. So, you know, there's been a lot of investment from the partnership community in 3DEP, and that investment has made it possible to do this effort to remap the nation's hydrography data. which is, as Steve noted, no small task, but we think we in our community are up for it. So it is a community-wide goal that depends on significant investments by our partner organizations. And USGS will manage the 3DHP on behalf of that broader community. So we look forward to working with you on partnerships. And I think that's all I have. If there are questions.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Steve. Well, thank you very much. And well, it's just about the end of the hour. I'll take over with a quick note that it looks like we're going to have a number of interesting calls coming up later in the year. And the next call would be scheduled for August 22nd at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern. And so thank you all very much for your time.